October 17th, 1943, 21,000 feet above Bougainville, Solomon Islands. The morning sun cut through scattered clouds as Major Gregory Boyington eased his F4U Corsair into a slow circle above Kahili airfield. Below him, barely visible through the morning haze, 60 Japanese fighters sat grounded on the packed coral runway. Behind Boyington, 23 more Corsairs held formation, their distinctive inverted gull wings catching the light like bent daggers. This was not a standard combat mission. This was provocation. Boyington had led his squadron here with one simple objective: make the Japanese so angry they'd send every available fighter into the air. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. 24 Marine pilots deliberately circling over one of the most heavily defended Japanese airbases in the South Pacific, daring an enemy force more than twice their size to come up and fight. Boyington keyed his radio. The transmission wasn't meant for his pilots. It was broadcast on the Japanese fighter frequency, in English, knowing full well that Japanese controllers could understand every word. Kahili, this is the American fighters above you. We're waiting. Send up your planes. Silence from below. Boyington circled tighter. Kahili, are you afraid? 60 fighters on the ground and not one brave enough to fly. The response came not in words but in action. On the coral runway below, ground crews scattered, propellers began turning. One by one, then in groups, Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters started their engines. Within minutes, 60 Japanese fighters were airborne and climbing hard toward the circling Corsairs. Boyington watched them come. 24 against 60. The odds were terrible. But Boyington knew something the Japanese pilots climbing toward him did not yet understand. The aircraft they were about to fight represented a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. The Corsair wasn't just another American fighter. It was a machine purpose-built to exploit physics in ways that made traditional dogfighting tactics obsolete. The battle that followed would validate a design philosophy and prove what American engineers had suspected for 2 years. Speed and power could defeat agility and numbers. But the path to this moment, to 24 Marine pilots deliberately picking a fight they shouldn't win, began not above Bougainville, but in a design office in Connecticut 5 years earlier, where engineers confronted a problem that seemed impossible to solve. 1938. Stratford, Connecticut. United Aircraft Corporation's Vought division received specifications from the United States Navy Bureau of Aeronautics that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The Navy wanted a carrier-based fighter capable of 400 miles per hour maximum speed, superior climb rate, and combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles. No existing fighter came close to meeting these requirements. The specification war for a reason. Naval intelligence reports from China detailed the capabilities of the new Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighter entering service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Early combat reports from the Second Sino-Japanese War described an aircraft that could outmaneuver anything in the sky, with range exceeding anything American designers thought possible for a carrier fighter. The Zero could escort bombers deep into Chinese territory, engage in extended combat, and still have fuel to return to base. American carrier doctrine required fighters that could protect the fleet against precisely this kind of threat. But matching the Zero's agility seemed impossible without sacrificing the speed and firepower advantages American fighters traditionally held. The Navy's answer was to not even try. Instead of matching Japanese maneuverability, American fighters would exploit superior speed, climb rate, and diving acceleration. If you couldn't turn with the Zero, you'd never let it force you into a turning fight. Vaught's chief engineer, Rex Beisel, understood the assignment. To achieve 400 miles per hour, the fighter would need an engine producing at least 1,800 horsepower. The only power plant that met the requirement was Pratt & Whitney's new R2800 double Wasp engine, a massive 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, but that engine required a propeller 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter. The propeller clearance problem seemed insurmountable. Standard fighter landing gear would place that massive propeller dangerously close to the carrier deck. Lengthening the landing gear enough to provide adequate clearance would create structural problems and add unacceptable weight. The gear would need to be so long it would become a structural weak point, prone to collapse during carrier landings. Beisel's solution was elegant and became the Corsair's most distinctive feature. Instead of raising the entire wing to accommodate the propeller, the wing would angle downward from the fuselage, then bend upward again toward the wingtips. An inverted, gull wing design. This configuration allowed the landing gear to be shorter and stronger while maintaining propeller clearance. The wing root met the fuselage at a right angle, simplifying the engineering, and the bent wing design had an unexpected aerodynamic advantage. By positioning the wing to fuselage junction perpendicular, the design minimized interference drag at the point where wing and body met. The Corsair would be faster than a conventional straight-wing design with the same engine. The prototype F4U-1 took flight on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bullard pushed the aircraft to 405 miles per hour in level flight. It was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. The Navy ordered production immediately, but the Corsair's revolutionary design created problems. Nobody anticipated until carrier trials began in 1942. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The long nose, necessary to house the massive R2-800 engine, created a blind spot directly ahead. During carrier approach, pilots couldn't see the landing signal officer or the carrier deck until the final seconds before touchdown. Worse, the Corsair's stall characteristics were vicious. As the aircraft slowed for landing, the left wing would drop suddenly with minimal warning. Combined with poor forward visibility, carrier landings became extraordinarily dangerous. After a series of accidents during carrier qualification trials, the Navy made a controversial decision. The Corsair would be declared unsuitable for carrier operations and assigned exclusively to land-based Marine squadrons. For a fighter specifically designed as a carrier aircraft, this was devastating. But the Marine Corps accepted the Corsair eagerly. Operating from land bases with longer runways and no need for carrier landings, Marine pilots could exploit the Corsair's performance advantages without the constraints of shipboard operations. The first Corsairs arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in February 1943. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, commanded by Major William Geese, began combat operations immediately. The results were initially mixed. On February 14, 1943, VMF 124 escorted Army Air Force bombers to Kahili airfield. The mission became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Japanese fighters shot down 2 Corsairs, 4 P-38s, 2 P-40s, and 2 B-24 bombers. The single Japanese Zero lost in the engagement was destroyed when it collided with a Corsair piloted by Lieutenant Gordon Lyon, Jr. Both pilots died. It was the Corsair's first confirmed kill, achieved through a mid-air collision. The disastrous debut revealed a fundamental problem. Most Marine pilots were trained in traditional dogfighting tactics developed for the F4F Wildcat. The Wildcat was slow but maneuverable. Pilots learned to engage in horizontal turning combat, using tight turns to gain position on enemy fighters. The Corsair couldn't fight that way. Its heavy weight and high wing loading made it mediocre in low-speed turning fights. Pilots trying to dogfight Zeros using Wildcat tactics were getting shot down. But a small number of pilots, many with combat experience against Japanese fighters, began developing new tactics that exploited the Corsair's actual strengths. The Thach weave, developed earlier for the Wildcat, was adapted for the Corsair. But the real breakthrough came from boom and zoom tactics. Never engage in sustained turning combat. Use superior speed to dictate engagement terms. Dive on the enemy from altitude. Make one high-speed pass. Then, use superior climb rate to regain altitude before the enemy can react. If bounced by enemy fighters, don't turn to fight. Accelerate away in a shallow dive, using speed to separate, then climb back to altitude beyond the enemy's ability to follow. These tactics required discipline, The natural instinct when an enemy fighter got on your tail was to turn hard and try to reverse the advantage. But in a Corsair against a Zero, that instinct would get you killed. The key was to trust the aircraft's energy advantages and refuse to fight on the enemy's terms. By mid-1943, Marine squadrons flying Corsairs achieved consistently favourable kill ratios. The first Corsair ace, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124, understood the aircraft's capabilities instinctively. On August 15, 1943, Walsh was flying escort for Navy bombers when approximately 50 Zeros attacked the formation. Walsh engaged aggressively, using boom and zoom tactics to shoot down 4 Zeros without sustaining any damage to his own aircraft. His Corsair absorbed several hits during the engagement, but remained flyable. The rugged construction that made carrier landings challenging also meant the Corsair could sustain battle damage that would destroy a Zero. American fighters were built around the philosophy that crew survival mattered more than maximum performance. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection for the pilot, and robust airframe construction added weight but dramatically improved survival rates. Japanese fighters prioritized range and maneuverability over protection. The Zero carried no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single 50 caliber round in the right location could set a Zero ablaze. American pilots noticed this vulnerability immediately. Corsairs firing 650 caliber machine guns could destroy a Zero with a 1 or 2 second burst. The Japanese fighter would ignite and disintegrate. By late summer 1943, the tactical situation in the Solomon Islands reached a critical phase. American forces controlled Guadalcanal and were advancing up the island chain toward Rabaul, the major Japanese base on New Britain. Japanese air power, centered at bases on Bougainville, represented the main obstacle to American advances. Kahili airfield, at the southern tip of Bougainville, housed a concentration of Japanese fighters and bombers within striking range of American positions. It was in this environment that Marine Fighting Squadron 214 was reconstituted under the command of Major Gregory Boyington. Boyington was 31 years old, a decade older than most of his pilots. He'd flown with the American volunteer group in China, the famous Flying Tigers, where he'd been credited with 6 victories. Returning to the Marine Corps in late 1942, Boyington had difficulty securing a combat command. His age, combined with a reputation for indiscipline, made him an unlikely candidate for squadron leadership. But the Marine Corps needed experienced fighter pilots desperately. In August 1943, Boyington was given command of a squadron assembled from pilots who'd been separated from their original units. Some were combat veterans whose squadrons had been disbanded. Others were replacement pilots who'd arrived in theatre but hadn't been assigned to operational squadrons. Still, others were pilots recovering from illness or injury. It was a collection of orphans and misfits. The pilots initially called themselves Boyington's Bastards, but the name was deemed unsuitable for official use. They became the Black Sheep instead, a reference to their status as cast-offs from other units. But the 27 pilots under Boyington's command were far more experienced than the name suggested. 8 had flown combat with Boyington in VMF 122. Several had extensive flight hours in Corsairs. 3 had flown with the Royal Canadian Air Force. The Black Sheep were not misfits. They were a hand-picked collection of the most experienced available pilots in theatre. Boyington instilled an aggressive philosophy from the beginning. The Black Sheep would not fly defensive patrols waiting for the enemy to attack. They would seek combat, deliberately provoking the Japanese into committing fighters to battle, where American advantages in speed and climb rate could be exploited. The squadron deployed to Bonica in the Russell Islands in September 1943. From there, they would fly long-range missions over Japanese-held territory, using the Corsairs' range to strike targets the Japanese thought were beyond American reach. Their first significant engagement came on September 16, 1943. Boyington led 24 Corsairs as high cover for Navy dive bombers attacking Balale Island, near Bougainville. Japanese fighters rose to intercept. In the ensuing battle, the Black Sheep claimed 11 confirmed kills. 5 were credited to Boyington. He'd become an ace in a single day. Aggressive employment of the Corsairs' speed and climb advantages produced overwhelming results. Over the next month, the Black Sheep developed a reputation for seeking combat in the most dangerous environments. They would escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory, then deliberately break formation and strafe Japanese airfields, goading fighters into the air. Boyington particularly favored a tactic of broadcasting English-language taunts on Japanese radio frequencies. He knew Japanese fighter controllers understood English. The taunts were calculated to provoke a response, forcing Japanese fighters to scramble and engage on American terms. The Japanese obliged. Throughout September and early October, Black Sheep Corsairs tangled with Japanese fighters over Bougainville, Rabaul, and the Northern Solomons. The squadron's kill total climbed rapidly, but the mission Boyington planned for October 17th was unprecedented in its audacity. Intelligence reported approximately 60 Japanese fighters based at Kahili airfield. Standard doctrine called for fighter sweeps with numerical superiority, ideally 2-to-1 advantage. Boyington proposed the opposite. He would take 24 Corsairs, circle directly above Kahili at altitude, and force the Japanese to commit every available fighter. The plan assumed the Corsairs could win even when outnumbered 2.5-to-1. The assumption was based on calculated assessment of comparative aircraft performance. A Corsair flown correctly could dominate a zero through energy tactics. The Japanese would climb to altitude and attempt to engage in turning combat. The Corsairs would refuse, using speed to control engagement geometry. But the plan required perfect execution and absolute discipline from all 24 pilots. A single pilot breaking formation and attempting a turning engagement could compromise the entire mission. Boyington briefed his pilots the night before. The objective was simple: make the Japanese commit every fighter they had, then destroy as many as possible without losing a single Corsair. It was an ambitious goal. No one believed zero losses were realistic, but Boyington's confidence was absolute. October 17th dawned clear and calm. Perfect flying weather. Boyington's 24 Corsairs took off from Vella La Vella shortly after dawn. They climbed to 21,000 feet and headed north toward Bougainville. The flight took 40 minutes. As they approached Kahili, Boyington ordered his pilots into a wide circle above the airfield. Then he began broadcasting his challenge on the Japanese fighter frequency. On the ground at Kahili, Japanese fighter controllers faced an impossible situation. American fighters circling directly overhead represented an intolerable provocation. But sending up fighters to engage a force at altitude gave the Americans every advantage. The Japanese chose to engage. Within minutes, Zeros began launching from the coral runway. They climbed rapidly, forming up into attack formations as they gained altitude, 60 fighters against 24. The mathematics seemed to favor the Japanese. But mathematics didn't account for physics. The Zero's maximum speed at 20,000 feet was approximately 330 miles per hour. The Corsair's maximum speed at the same altitude exceeded 400 miles per hour. The Zero's climb rate was approximately 2,400 feet per minute. The Corsair's climb rate exceeded 3,000 feet per minute. The Zero could turn inside the Corsair at low speed, but at high speed, both aircraft had similar turn rates. The key was never letting the fight slow down. Boyington watched the Zeros climb toward his formation. He waited until they reached 18,000 feet, then ordered his pilots to attack. The Corsairs dove. Acceleration was brutal. Within seconds, they exceeded 400 miles per hour in a steep dive. The Zeros attempted to turn into the attack, but the geometry was wrong. The Corsairs flashed past, each pilot selecting a target, firing a short burst, then pulling up hard into a zoom climb. The initial pass destroyed 6 Zeros. The Japanese fighters that evaded the attack turned hard, attempting to pursue the climbing Corsairs. But the Americans were already 3,000 feet higher, setting up for another pass. The Zeros climbed after them, bleeding energy in a futile attempt to close the gap. Boyington led his formation through a second diving pass. Another 4 Zeros fell. The pattern repeated: dive, attack, climb, the Corsairs controlled the engagement completely. Japanese pilots attempting to force turn in combat found themselves chasing Corsairs that simply accelerated away and climbed beyond reach. The few Zeros that managed gun positions on Corsairs found their targets pulling away effortlessly. A Corsair at 400 miles per hour could outrun a Zero in level flight. In a dive, the difference became overwhelming. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When Japanese fighters finally broke off and dove away toward their base, 20 had been shot down. Not a single Corsair was lost. Not one Marine pilot was even wounded. The tactical implications were profound. A force outnumbered 2.5 to 1 had achieved complete victory through superior aircraft performance and disciplined tactics. The battle above Kahili validated everything American fighter designers and tacticians had believed about energy fighting. If you had speed and climb rate advantages, you could dictate engagement terms completely. The enemy could never force you to fight on their terms. Boyington's radio taunts had worked perfectly. By provoking the Japanese into committing their entire available force, he'd created a situation where American advantages became overwhelming. The Japanese sent up 60 fighters, expecting numerical superiority to carry the day. Instead, they discovered that their most feared opponent wasn't another fighter pilot. It was physics itself. The battle became legendary within Marine aviation circles immediately. Boyington received the Medal of Honor for the engagement, but the real significance wasn't Boyington's leadership or even the Black Sheep's tactical execution. The significance was what the Corsair represented, a systematic engineering approach to fighter design that prioritized measurable performance advantages over traditional dogfighting capabilities. The aircraft that Japanese forces would come to call Whistling Death wasn't feared because of any single engagement. It was feared because it represented a philosophy of warfare that Japanese aviation couldn't counter. American fighters were designed around the principle that superior technology, properly employed, would defeat superior skill or courage. The Corsair embodied that principle completely. But understanding why the Corsair dominated required looking beyond the aircraft itself to the design philosophy that created it. American and Japanese aviation followed fundamentally different engineering paths. Those paths were determined not by technical capability, but by strategic assumptions about what role fighters would play in the war to come. The decisions made in design offices in Connecticut and Nagoya in the late 1930s would determine which pilots lived and died above the Pacific 4 years later. The story of the Corsair was ultimately the story of those decisions and their consequences. Two nations, two approaches to fighter design, two completely different philosophies about the value of pilot lives versus mission requirements. The Americans chose to protect their crews. The Japanese chose to maximize capability. History rendered its verdict in the flaming wreckage of Japanese fighters scattered across the Posen, South Pacific. Understanding that verdict required examining not just American design philosophy, but Japanese as well. The Zero that the Corsair fought was itself a revolutionary aircraft, purpose-built to accomplish missions beyond what American designers thought possible. But the engineering compromises that gave the Zero its extraordinary range also created vulnerabilities that American fighters would exploit ruthlessly. The contrast between the Corsair and the Zero represented more than different design philosophies. It represented different values about what was worth sacrificing in pursuit of victory. The Americans sacrificed performance for survivability. The Japanese sacrificed survivability for performance. By 1943, the consequences of those choices became undeniable. Every engagement between Corsairs and Zeros repeated the same pattern. The American fighter would refuse turning combat, using speed and climb rate to control the engagement completely. The Zero pilot, trained in traditional dogfighting tactics, found himself unable to force the kind of fight where Japanese aircraft held advantages. The Corsair pilot, trained in energy fighting, never allowed the engagement to slow down to speeds where the Zero's maneuverability mattered. The result was mathematically predictable. Over the course of the war, Corsairs would be credited with 2,140 air-to-air victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft, an 11-to-1 kill ratio, Against the Zero specifically, the ratio was even more favorable, 12-1. These statistics reflected not superior pilot skill, but superior aircraft design philosophy correctly applied. The Americans built fighters that brought pilots home alive. The Japanese built fighters that reached distant targets. Both succeeded at their design goals. But in sustained combat, the philosophy that valued pilot survival proved decisively superior. American pilots accumulated experience, trained replacements, and grew progressively more effective. Japanese pilots died faster than replacements could be trained. Experience was lost with every burning Zero. By late 1943, the disparity was becoming catastrophic for Japanese aviation. The pilots who'd attacked Pearl Harbor and dominated the early war were dead or reassigned to training duties. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 6 months compared to the 18 months to 2 years American pilots received. These inexperienced pilots flying aircraft offering no protection against battle damage died at appalling rates. The Corsair was particularly lethal against inexperienced pilots. The aircraft's speed meant it could disengage from any unfavorable situation. Novice Zero pilots would commit to attacks that experienced pilots knew were suicidal. The Corsair would simply accelerate away, climb, and reverse the engagement. By 1944, American pilots reported that Japanese fighter opposition had become noticeably less aggressive. Experienced Japanese pilots understood the Corsair's capabilities and refused to engage unless holding overwhelming altitude or positional advantage. But inexperienced pilots still attempted to fight the way training manuals taught them. They tried to force Corsairs into turning combat. They pursued climbing Corsairs, burning energy in a futile attempt to close the gap. They dove after Corsairs that were already accelerating away beyond any hope of catching them. Every violation of sound energy fighting principles resulted in death. The pattern was visible in every major engagement. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, Corsairs and Hellcats destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The engagement became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots described shooting down Japanese aircraft so easily it felt like target practice. The overwhelming victory wasn't due to numerical superiority. It was due to systematic exploitation of American technological advantages against poorly trained Japanese pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The October 17th mission over Kahili represented the Corsair at the peak of its effectiveness. Well-trained Marine pilots flying superior aircraft, using tactics specifically developed to exploit their performance advantages, achieved a victory that shouldn't have been possible. 24 against 60, 0 losses. 20 enemies destroyed. The mathematics violated every principle of aerial combat theory that emphasized numerical superiority. But the mathematics made perfect sense when you understood what the Corsair actually was. It wasn't a fighter designed to dogfight. It was a fighter designed to impose physics on the enemy. Speed, climb rate, and diving acceleration weren't just performance characteristics. They were weapons that denied the enemy any opportunity to fight on favorable terms. He simply had to refuse to participate in one. This philosophy extended beyond individual combat tactics to strategic employment. The Corsair's long range meant Marine squadrons could operate from forward bases and strike deep into Japanese-held territory. The aircraft's rugged construction meant it could absorb battle damage and return home. The heavy armament meant a single pass could destroy multiple targets. Every aspect of the design reflected a systematic approach to air warfare that prioritized mission effectiveness and pilot survival over traditional notions of fighter agility. The Japanese had no effective counter. They couldn't match the Corsair's speed without redesigning the Zero completely, a process that would take years. They couldn't match American pilot training because they didn't have the fuel, the time, or the aircraft to train replacement pilots properly. They couldn't match American production because they didn't have the industrial capacity. By late 1943, Japan was losing the technological and industrial war as decisively as it was losing the tactical war in the air. The Corsair was both cause and symbol of that defeat. Every engagement proved the same lesson. Superior engineering, properly employed, defeated courage and skill. American pilots respected Japanese aviators' bravery. But bravery couldn't overcome a 400-mile-per-hour speed differential or a 3,000 foot-per-minute climb rate advantage. The Marines on the ground at Okinawa had their own name for the Corsairs flying cover above them. They called them the Angels of Okinawa. When Japanese positions were overrunning American lines, when artillery couldn't reach the enemy, when conventional support failed, Corsairs would appear. Diving, through anti-aircraft fire, delivering rockets and napalm with precision that seemed impossible, then climbing away before the Japanese could respond. The Corsairs' role at Okinawa represented the full evolution of American fighter doctrine. The aircraft, designed as a pure interceptor, had become a multi-role platform capable of air superiority, close air support, and fleet defense simultaneously. No other fighter in the Pacific could match this versatility while maintaining combat effectiveness in all roles. But the path from October 1943's triumph above Kahili to Okinawa's final battles ran through some of the darkest moments of the Pacific War. For Gregory Boyington and the Black Sheep Squadron, the October 17th mission represented the peak. The decline came swiftly. January 3, 1944, Rabaul, New Britain. Boyington led 48 Corsairs and Hellcats on a fighter sweep over the massive Japanese naval base. The mission objective was simple: destroy as many enemy aircraft as possible and disrupt Japanese air operations. VMF 214 was completing its second combat tour. The squadron would rotate back to the United States within days. For Boyington, this represented one final opportunity to add to his victory total. He was tied with World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker at 26 confirmed kills. One more would break the record. Two more would give him 28, matching the highest score of any Marine pilot in the war. The sweep encountered two large formations of Zeros. Boyington immediately engaged, separating from his wingmen in pursuit of a target. He claimed one Zero destroyed. Other pilots confirmed seeing the Japanese fighter go down in flames. Victory number 27. Boyington pressed the attack, chasing another Zero through heavy anti-aircraft fire. He was flying too low, below cloud cover, isolated from his formation. Multiple Zeros converged on his position. Boyington's Corsair absorbed. Multiple hits. The engine began failing. He had two choices: attempt to reach friendly territory or bail out over enemy-held waters. The engine made the decision for him. It quit completely. Boyington ejected at low altitude. His parachute deployed, and he hit the water hard. He inflated his life raft and watched Japanese aircraft circle overhead. Within minutes, a submarine surfaced nearby. Boyington hoped it was American. It wasn't. The Japanese submarine I-181 recovered him and transported him to Rabaul. For the next 20 months, Boyington endured captivity in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. He was beaten regularly. His combat wounds were left untreated. He contracted malaria. The Japanese never publicly announced they'd captured him. Back in the United States, he was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. In February 1944, while Boyington was classified as missing, President Franklin Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor. The presentation was held without the recipient present. Most assumed the medal was posthumous. 5 days after Boyington was shot down, VMF 214 completed its combat tour. The squadron was disbanded. The pilots were dispersed to other units. In 84 days of combat, the Black Sheep had been credited with 97 confirmed aerial victories and more than 100 aircraft destroyed or damaged on the ground. 9 pilots had become aces. The disbanding of the original Black Sheep squadron marked the end of an era, but the Corsairs' war continued. By mid-1944, the tactical situation in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't replace aircraft losses. Pilot training programs, starved for fuel and aircraft, produced replacement pilots with minimal flight hours. Meanwhile, American production expanded. New Corsair variants with improved engines and armament entered service. More importantly, American pilot training improved systematically. Lessons learned from combat in the Solomons were incorporated into training curricula. New pilots arrived in theatre already proficient in energy fighting tactics. They understood the Corsairs' strengths and limitations. They knew not to dogfight Zeros. They knew how to use speed and altitude advantages. The result was a qualitative gap that widened with every passing month. By late 1944, Japanese aviation was in systemic collapse. Experienced pilots were dead or grounded by fuel shortages. Replacement pilots couldn't survive long enough to gain experience. Aircraft quality declined as Japanese industry struggled to maintain production under American bombing. The technological advantages that American fighters like the Corsair possessed became overwhelming. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944, demonstrated Japan's desperation. Unable to contest American air superiority through conventional means, Japanese commanders authorized organized suicide attacks. Kamikaze tactics represented an admission that Japanese pilots couldn't compete with American fighters in normal combat. If you couldn't defeat the enemy through skill or technology, you could still inflict casualties through willingness to die. The first organized kamikaze attacks struck American ships supporting the invasion of Leyte. The results were devastating. Conventional air defense tactics assumed attacking aircraft would attempt to survive. Kamikazes deliberately crashed into targets, accepting certain death to guarantee hits. Anti-aircraft fire could destroy the aircraft, but if the attack began close enough to the target, momentum would carry the flaming wreckage onto the ship anyway. American commanders responded by reorganizing air defense doctrine completely. Fighter patrols were pushed further from the fleet, creating layered defense zones. Radar picket destroyers stationed miles from the main fleet provided early warning. Corsairs and Hellcats intercepted incoming kamikazes as far from the fleet as possible. Commander John Thatch developed what he called the Big Blue Blanket, continuous fighter coverage over the fleet and Japanese airfields. The Corsair proved ideally suited for anti-kamikaze operations. Its speed meant it could intercept incoming attacks with time to spare. Its climb rate allowed it to gain altitude advantage quickly. Its rugged construction meant it could absorb damage from Japanese defensive fire and continue fighting, and its heavy armament meant a single pass could destroy multiple targets. But the kamikaze threat reached its peak at Okinawa. April through June 1945, the Americans launched the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War. Over 60,000 soldiers and Marines landed on April 1st. The battle for the island would rage for 82 days. Japan responded with nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks launched from airfields on Kyushu and Formosa. The scale of the kamikaze effort at Okinawa dwarfed anything seen previously. Japanese commanders committed their remaining air strength completely. Training aircraft were modified to carry bombs. Obsolete fighters were pressed into service. Even jet-powered Oka rocket bombs, essentially manned missiles, were employed. The attacks tested American air defense to its limits. Corsairs flew continuous patrols over the fleet and along likely approach routes. They intercepted kamikaze formations before the suicide aircraft reached attack positions. The combat was brutal and exhausting. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day, engaging waves of Japanese aircraft that had no intention of evading or surviving. Some kamikazes were piloted by experienced aviators who used evasive maneuvers to reach their targets. Others were flown by pilots with barely enough training to take off and fly straight. Both were equally lethal if they reached the fleet. The statistics from Okinawa tell the story. Nearly 1,500 kamikazes were launched. Fewer than 300 reached the fleet. American fighters destroyed most before they could attack. Of those that did reach the fleet, anti-aircraft fire shot down many more, but the kamikazes that got through inflicted catastrophic damage. 36 ships were sunk. 368 were damaged. Over 4,800 American sailors died. For the Marines fighting on the ground, the Corsairs overhead represented more than air defense. When Marine units encountered Japanese positions that couldn't be reduced by conventional means, they called for air support. Corsairs would arrive minutes later, delivering rockets, napalm, and bombs with precision that eliminated the target while minimizing risk to friendly forces. The close air support doctrine developed at Okinawa would influence American military aviation for decades. The Marines gave the Corsairs a name that captured their role perfectly: Angels of Okinawa. When everything else failed, when the situation seemed impossible, Corsairs would appear, diving through enemy fire, delivering ordnance with surgical precision, climbing away untouched, then returning for another pass, and another, until the threat was eliminated. The nickname reflected more than gratitude. It reflected a fundamental truth about the Corsairs' design philosophy. American engineers built an aircraft that could protect the people operating it while accomplishing the mission. The Corsair could absorb battle damage that would destroy other fighters. It could operate in conditions that grounded less capable aircraft. It could perform multiple roles without losing effectiveness in any. This versatility came from systematic engineering. The R-2-800 engine provided power margins that allowed heavy fuel loads, heavy armament, and armor protection without compromising performance. The inverted gull wing provided structural strength that allowed the aircraft to survive high-G maneuvers and rough, carrier landings. The rugged landing gear could handle improvised airfields and less than perfect approaches. Every design decision reflected American industrial philosophy: build strong, build reliable, build redundant systems, accept weight penalties if they improve survivability, prioritize getting the crew home alive over marginal performance improvements. This philosophy meant American aircraft were generally heavier than equivalent Japanese designs. But it also meant American pilots survived to fight again. The contrast with Japanese design philosophy remained stark through war's end. Japan continued producing Zeros with minimal protection for pilots. When American fighters achieved air superiority, Japanese pilots died at rates that made sustained combat operations impossible. By 1945, experienced Japanese aviators were nearly extinct. The few who survived were held back for final defense of the home islands. August 1945. The war ended with Japan's surrender following atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Among the liberated prisoners of war was Gregory Boyington. He emerged from Omori prison camp near Tokyo on August 30th. He'd lost significant weight. His combat wounds had never properly healed. But he was alive. On September 12th, Boyington returned to Naval Air Station Alameda in California. 21 former Black Sheep Squadron members met him. The reunion became national news. Boyington's survival seemed miraculous. For 20 months, he'd been presumed dead. His Medal of Honor had been awarded posthumously. Now he returned to receive it in person. President Harry Truman presented the medal at a White House ceremony on October 5, 1945. Boyington retired from the Marine Corps in August 1947 with the rank of colonel. His wartime memoir, Bar Bar Black Sheep, published in 1958, became a bestseller. A television series loosely based on his experiences aired in the 1970s. But Boyington's legacy was complicated. His personal life was troubled. He struggled with alcoholism. He had difficult relationships. The television portrayal of the Black Sheep as misfits and troublemakers bore little resemblance to the highly experienced pilots who actually flew with VMF 214, yet none of this diminished what Boyington and his pilots accomplished during 84 days of combat in late 1943. They proved the Corsair could dominate in the hands of well-trained pilots using proper tactics. The Corsair's combat record speaks for itself. 2,140 air-to-air victories, 189 losses to enemy aircraft, 11-to-1 kill ratio overall, 12-to-1 against the Zero specifically, over 64,000 combat sorties flown, 15,000 tons of bombs dropped. The Corsair remained in production longer than any other piston engine fighter. The last examples rolled off assembly lines in 1952, a decade after the first combat deployment. The aircraft saw extensive service in the Korean War, primarily in ground attack roles. Jet aircraft dominated air-to-air combat by 1950, but the Corsair's payload capacity and loiter time made it ideal for close air support. Marine and Navy pilots flew Corsairs in support of ground operations throughout the war. The aircraft proved as effective in Korea as it had been in the Pacific. Beyond American service, Corsairs equipped air forces around the world. France operated Corsairs in Indochina and Algeria. The Royal Navy flew them in Korea. Honduras didn't retire its last Corsairs until 1979, making it the last military operator of the type. The longevity demonstrated the fundamental soundness of the design. But the true significance of the Corsair extends beyond statistics and service records. The aircraft represented a philosophy of warfare that proved decisively superior to alternatives. American military aviation in World War II embraced technology and industrial capacity as force multipliers. Build aircraft with performance margins sufficient to overcome enemy advantages. Protect your crews so experience accumulates rather than being lost with each battle. Train pilots thoroughly before committing them to combat. Use superior industrial capacity to overwhelm the enemy with numbers. This approach wasn't uniquely American. Britain and the Soviet Union followed similar principles, but American industrial capacity allowed these principles to be executed at a scale unmatched by any other combatant. The Corsair was one piece of a systematic approach that produced victory through overwhelming material advantage combined with tactical competence. Japanese aviation followed a different path. Maximize performance by minimizing weight. Accept pilot casualties as inevitable cost of achieving mission objectives. Rely on superior training and fighting spirit to overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy worked brilliantly in the war's opening months, when Japanese pilots were the best trained in the world and American forces were unprepared. But as the war progressed, the flaws became fatal. You can't replace experienced pilots faster than combat kills them if your training pipeline is inadequate. You can't maintain aircraft quality when your industrial base is being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. You can't compete with an enemy that produces 10 aircraft for every one you build. Most critically, you can't protect pilots who fly aircraft without armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero that the Corsair fought was a brilliant aircraft designed to accomplish specific missions. It succeeded at those missions in 1941 and 1942, but it couldn't adapt to changing tactical situations or survive attrition warfare. By 1943, the Zero was obsolete not because its performance declined, but because American fighters exploited vulnerabilities that were designed into the aircraft from the beginning. The Corsair exploited those vulnerabilities ruthlessly. Every engagement demonstrated the same lesson. When properly flown, the Corsair could impose combat on its own terms. The Zero pilot had to accept the fight the Corsair pilot chose or disengage completely. And disengaging meant abandoning the mission, ceding air superiority, accepting defeat without firing a shot. This wasn't about courage or skill. Japanese pilots were as brave as any who flew in the war. Many were highly skilled. But bravery couldn't overcome a 60-mile-per-hour speed deficit. Skill couldn't force an enemy who refused to slow down into a turning fight. The physics were immutable. The aircraft with higher speed and better climb rate controlled engagement geometry completely. The October 17th mission over Kahili demonstrated this principle perfectly. 24 Corsairs against 60 Zeros. The mathematics suggested Japanese victory. But mathematics didn't account for physics. The Corsairs dictated every aspect of the engagement. They chose when to attack. They chose the attack angle. They chose when to disengage. The Zeros could only react, always one step behind, always at a disadvantage, unable to force the fight into regimes where they held advantages. 20 Zeros destroyed, 0 Corsairs lost. The result wasn't luck or superior piloting. It was the inevitable outcome of deploying superior technology using tactics specifically designed to exploit that superiority. Boyington's aggression in provoking the battle was bold. But the victory was predetermined the moment Japanese fighters committed to climbing toward Corsairs, holding altitude advantage. This was the lesson of the Corsair. Properly designed aircraft, flown by adequately trained pilots using sound tactics, would defeat even superior opponents through systematic exploitation of performance advantages. You didn't need to be a better pilot than your opponent if your aircraft was fast enough to refuse unfavorable combat. You didn't need superior dogfighting skills if you never let the fight slow down to speeds where those skills mattered. The Americans learned this lesson thoroughly. Post-war fighter development focused obsessively on speed, climb rate, and energy retention. Maneuverability remained important, but secondary to performance advantages that could control engagement geometry. The doctrine developed flying Corsairs against Zeros influenced jet fighter design through multiple generations. The Japanese learned different lessons. Post-war Japanese aviation, when it re-emerged, abandoned the lightweight, high maneuverability philosophy completely. Modern Japanese fighters prioritized technology, systems integration, and pilot survivability. The philosophy that built the Zero died with Imperial Japan. The Corsair outlived its enemies and most of its contemporaries. When Boyington flew his last combat mission in January 1944, the Corsair had been in combat service barely a year. When the last military Corsair was retired in 1979, 36 years had passed since the type's combat debut. No other World War II fighter served so long. That longevity testified to fundamental design soundness. The Corsair was built strong enough to absorb modifications, powerful enough to carry increased loads, versatile enough to adapt to changing mission requirements. These attributes came from American engineering philosophy that prioritized robust systems over maximum performance. The Whistling Death nickname, probably created by American publicity departments rather than frightened Japanese soldiers, nevertheless captured something true about the aircraft. The distinctive sound made by air rushing through wing root intakes during high-speed dives became synonymous with American air superiority in the Pacific. Japanese forces, hearing that sound, knew what followed. High-speed attack runs impossible to evade, heavy firepower impossible to survive, then rapid climb beyond ability to pursue. For Japanese pilots, the Corsair represented technological inevitability. You couldn't outrun it, you couldn't outclimb it, you couldn't catch it in a dive. If you tried to turn with it at high speed, it matched your turn rate. If you slowed down to exploit superior low-speed maneuverability, it simply accelerated away and set up another attack. There was no counter-tactic, no defensive maneuver that worked consistently. The only solution was to not engage at all. But not engaging meant ceding air superiority. It meant abandoning bomber formations to interception. It meant allowing American fighters to strafe ground positions unopposed. It meant defeat. So Japanese pilots engaged despite knowing the outcome. They fought with courage and skill against an opponent whose advantages were insurmountable, and they died in flames over the South Pacific, the Solomon Sea, the Philippine Sea, the waters around Okinawa. The Corsair killed them, not through superior pilot quality, but through superior engineering. American designers chose to protect their crews. Japanese designers chose to maximize range and maneuverability. Both choices were rational, given strategic assumptions about how the war would be fought. But American assumptions proved correct, and Japanese assumptions proved fatal. In the end, the war in the Pacific was won by industrial capacity and technological superiority properly applied. The Corsair symbolized that victory. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, from VMF 124's difficult debut to the Black Sheep's legendary missions to the final kamikaze interceptions, the Corsair proved that well-engineered systems, operated by adequately trained personnel, would defeat courage and skill, unsupported by equivalent material advantage. The lesson extends beyond aviation and beyond World War II. Organizations that invest in their people's survivability, that build robust systems rather than optimized fragility, that accept weight penalties for redundancy and protection, tend to prevail over organizations that maximize performance while minimizing resilience. The Americans built fighters to bring pilots home. The Japanese built fighters to reach distant targets. Both succeeded at their design goals, but in sustained combat, survivability proved more valuable than maximum range. 24 Corsairs over Kahili, 60 Zeros rising to meet them. October 17th, 1943. The outcome was never in doubt. Physics guaranteed American victory before the first shot was fired. The only question was how complete that victory would be. 20-0 answered that question definitively. It was complete, total, overwhelming, and it was repeated in every major engagement for the rest of the war. The Corsair didn't win the Pacific War alone, but it represented the philosophy that did win. Superior technology, adequately applied, defeats courage and skill, unsupported by equivalent material advantage. The Japanese understood this lesson by war's end. They learned it in flaming wreckage scattered across the Pacific. They learned it from pilots who never returned. They learned it from victories that couldn't be repeated because the pilots who won them were dead. Gregory Boyington died in January 1988 at age 75. He never flew another combat mission after that January day over Rabaul. But he lived long enough to see his legend grow beyond anything he accomplished during 84 days of combat. The black sheep became myth. The missions became television episodes. The reality became obscured by entertainment. But the reality was simpler and more profound than myth. Boyington led experienced pilots flying superior aircraft using tactics that exploited their advantages. They fought aggressively because they could afford to be aggressive. Their aircraft would protect them if things went wrong. They could disengage if outnumbered. They could refuse combat unless conditions favored them. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated risk-taking backed by superior technology. The Corsair gave them that option. The Zero couldn't give Japanese pilots equivalent protection. So Japanese pilots fought knowing that any mistake was likely fatal. They couldn't disengage easily. They couldn't refuse unfavorable combat. They had to accept whatever fight developed and trust their skill to overcome material disadvantage. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. The statistics tell that story clearly. 11-1. That number encapsulates everything about the Corsair's dominance. For every American pilot shot down, 11 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The ratio wasn't caused by American pilots being 11 times more skilled. It was caused by American aircraft being engineered to let adequately skilled pilots survive long enough to become highly skilled pilots. Experience accumulated. Tactics improved. Lessons learned were passed to new pilots. The system became progressively more effective. Japanese aviation couldn't replicate this. Experienced pilots died. Lessons were lost. New pilots arrived with minimal training and died before gaining experience. The system degraded rather than improving. By war's end, Japanese aviation was staffed by semi-trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft with minimal fuel and ammunition. They fought bravely. They accomplished nothing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.